This is likely to have a little bit of a different tone to it than many of the other presentations today. So I think for starters what I want to do is actually introduce you to the word Ubuntu, in case you're not familiar, and it is part of the name of our organization, Living Ubuntu. But since it has a South African origin, a lot of people are not familiar with it. And it, other than being part of the name of the organization, it really has a message that pertains to the topic that I want to address today. So I'm going to read you a quote from Desmond Tutu, and it is the one that's on the screen. Ubuntu is very difficult to render into a Western language. When we want to give high praise to someone, we say, "You Ubuntu." Hey, so-and-so has Ubuntu. Then you are generous, you are hospitable, you are friendly and caring and compassionate. You share what you have. It is to say, my humanity is caught up, is inextricably bound up in what is yours. We say, a person is a person through other persons. A person with Ubuntu is open and available to others, affirming of others, does not feel threatened that others are able and good, for he or she has a proper self-assurance that comes from knowing that he or she belongs in a greater whole, and is diminished when others are humiliated or diminished, when others are tortured or oppressed. To forgive is not just to be altruistic, it is the best form of self-interest. What dehumanizes you inexorably dehumanizes me. Forgiveness gives people resilience, enabling them to survive and emerge still human, despite all efforts to dehumanize them. So, on this topic of staying human in the face of inhumanity, I think there's relevant questions. What is inhumanity? What does it really mean to stay human? How do we accomplish that? But I want to start by telling you a little bit of my own personal story, and then why Living Ubuntu got its start. Early on for me in life, a lot of things happened in my childhood that were very traumatizing. And there were various situations within the home, outside the home. And I developed very severe post-traumatic stress disorder very early in life, very severe depression early in life. Did not come from an upbringing that gave me a foundation to function in the world, basically. And a lot of my life early on, early adulthood, was spent trying to figure out how to recover from all that had happened. And at this point in life, my own early story gives me a lot of material for trying to put together this sense of how to stay human in the face of inhumanity. Today in Living Ubuntu, we have a project called Orange County for Darfur. That's certainly another way that we face chronic inhumanities. We deal with the anti-genocide movement, genocide prevention, the atrocities in Sudan and Congo and Burma. And often when we think of inhumanity, we think of those atrocities. And yet, there's a lot of degrees of inhumanity, or a lot of different types of inhumanity. And there's ways that we can cut ourselves off from our own heart and soul, living life in a society in sort of an inhuman way that we demonstrate merely by coldness or doing things by routine, becoming the automaton. So within this, there's many ways that you can interpret what I'm talking about, and I think it applies to this entire range. So for me, reflecting back on the things that went on for me early in life, it gave me a lot of ability to recognize that it is really just human beings that perpetrate inhumanities. And I think one of the mistakes that we get caught up in is losing sight of that. And it's a tough thing to stay in touch enough with our own human self, to feel our own heart, to delve into whatever our darkest issues are that plague us, to address and bring healing to our own wounds sufficiently that we can look at another person who commits horrors and still retain their humanity. So this talk isn't about how to see perpetrators as human beings, but that really is an aspect of it. Because the moment that we demonize anybody, we've lost part of our own humanity. And that may be one of the toughest challenges that we have, but it's a really critical piece of this to look at. And it seems to me that too often when we talk about oneness and the interconnectedness of humanity, there's always sort of a but. We're all at one, we're all one except for people that do these things. We're interconnected, except we don't want to acknowledge those that we see as other, or those we don't like, or those we don't approve of. And I think that this is really sort of this is where we need to evolve as a species, is this sense of really embracing our interconnectedness for all of humanity. And recognizing that those that perpetrate horrors are not just, they're not bad seeds. They're not innately evil and somehow different. Part of what can be the hardest challenge to embrace is to recognize the potential within us, under the right circumstances, to commit any of the atrocities that we would seek to stand against. And yet, unless we do that, we're going to continue to otherize and not be able to, potentially not be able to accomplish the peace that we seek. I want to talk a little bit about the start of Living Ubuntu and why. Given my background and a lot of emphasis, like I said, on trying to find my own healing after my own severe traumas. I had been in the field of psychotherapy in private practice for a long time. I entered the field quite young, actually, probably trying to sort through my own background and perhaps doing it a little too early, even for me. But nevertheless, after being in private practice for a long time, one of the things that bothered me about private practice was you really can only help people who have enough money to pay you. And so it can be a very elitist profession. And over time, that began to be very disturbing to me, to live so much of my life helping people who had a lot of money to pay me to be able to do that. Another factor was kind of coming to a climax right around 2004, reading stories of wars in the world, especially at that time. In 2004, there was a civil war going on, where brutalities were taking place in southern Sudan, but there was also the Darfur genocide that was about a year into its process. And so sort of tracking these stories of what was going on in Sudan in its early stages. And what happened to me is I thought, with my knowledge as a psychotherapist, putting together how excruciatingly painful my own childhood had been, and knowing the extremely difficult process it had taken me to pursue wellness, and to know that I lived my entire life in Orange County, born and raised here, that I had access to resources and to getting help far more easily than most people on the planet. And yet for me, it was a very hard, painful, excruciating journey that many times I thought would be unsurvivable. And when trauma has been pervasive, when PTSD is severe, when depression is pervasive, when the wounds are deep, it can feel unsurvivable, even though it is. So what disturbed me, bringing my own life history combined with my professional knowledge, was to look around the world and see the vast number of conflicts in this world, and to know how many people were being traumatized. How many children were being born into war zones? How many children in a war zone inevitably were not getting their needs met, even if they had the best of intentions from their parents? And where would these people go to heal? And knowing that post-traumatic stress disorder increases cycles of violence, it increases a lot of other things also. But what I couldn't understand was, how are we going to survive on this planet if there are these many conflicts and these many people getting traumatized and this little help? So living Ubuntu came out of my own knowledge of how hard it is to heal, how painful it is to not have help, how difficult it is under the best of circumstances, and feeling like we need a fundamental shift on many levels. That we've got to increase our sense of where we place value, that we value human beings and human life more, and that we recognize human suffering. And human suffering is not just in the externals that we tend to identify more. Human suffering can be invisible and yet profound. And what I couldn't see is what is going to happen to this planet if we don't begin to deal differently, changing the paradigm, changing our culture, changing our beliefs, and valuing the healing process that needs to happen, and creating programs that will address trauma recovery in mass numbers. So a lot of the focus in Living Ubuntu has to do with raising awareness of issues of trauma and seeking to develop methods that can be used in large numbers of people for trauma recovery, as well as a few other things, addressing stress, compassion fatigue, and supporting health and well-being, living in community, and with a focus on recognizing the connection between the mind and the body. Can you pull up the Lowen quote? Alexander Lowen is actually the founder of bioenergetics, and that's my background. I'm certified as a bioenergetic therapist. I doubt there's any of you in this room that knows what that means, except maybe accepting Anshul, who's the co-founder of the organization. But it's a form of psychotherapy that uses somatic methods in its work. So it uses body work. It recognizes the wounds and the trauma that we hold in the body and uses methods to release, not just talk therapy, not just the psychological. So I really appreciate this quote from Alexander Lowen. If a person cannot see horror, then he can neither see beauty, nor sadness, anger, fear, or love. And we tend to want to block the horror, but we don't have a culture that really encourages us to do this. But we tend to not recognize the price we're paying. That when we block out one aspect of life, we inevitably block out others. And so to be able to be a whole person, to be able to maintain our compassion and our love and our heart, inevitably part of what we need to be witness to is the horror. And again, sometimes the horror is in outright atrocities. Sometimes the horror is in the cold treatment of one another. Sometimes the horror is the disconnect we do to ourselves, where we expect ourselves to keep going and we ignore the deadening lifestyle that has become normal in our culture. I think part of how we are tuning out the horror, part of the deadening process, I think we really need to take a hard look at what is going on in our culture today, where we've gone in recent times. I mean, there's a lot of these issues that have been around for a very long time, but we have some new ones we're dealing with. We love the convenience of electronic gadgets. but we seem to be using them to multitask more without recognizing that we're losing human contact, we're losing human connection, we're losing time in nature, we're losing time with animals. And there's a sense of denial that attempting to do so much communication and spend so much time electronically, it really can have a very numbing, deadening influence on us. And the problem with growing numb is once you're numb, you don't really tend to feel how numb you are. And there's a real correlation between symptoms of trauma and symptoms of chronic stress. They're more on a continuum, but they both activate your fight-flight system. So they're actually very similar, just by degree. So sort of the psychic numbing that comes with PTSD can also be very true, maybe to a lesser degree, in leading a chronically stressful lifestyle. And if you look around, I mean, I don't know if you guys seem to maybe know a few people that I haven't met, but of those I know, I don't know anyone that isn't feeling kind of a chronic overwhelm, a chronic busyness, a shortage of time, having trouble unplugging, having trouble letting down, far distant from kind of a contemplative life of self-exploration. It's as if it's come to be normal to lead a disembodied life, to go through the motions, and to accept a life where we don't really feel very much of anything, not on a deep feeling level. So I think that this is very personally troubling to me, that we're really denying what we're doing to ourselves and the implications. Our culture does not give us a lot of support for making wise choices for ourselves. It's the norm, maybe, to be sleep deprived, to not take good care of ourselves in many, many ways, and just keep going. And in fact, a lot of times people will pat us on the back for being so strong. And ultimately it weakens us, because we're not machines. We're human beings. And when we begin to treat ourselves as if we're machines, we're becoming a little bit more inhuman. Because you can't disconnect from yourself and still be fully present and loving and compassionate towards others. We develop blocks, we develop blind spots. I don't know if any of you are familiar with what got called the Good Samaritan study, where they studied a bunch of theological students. And in one scenario they were in a rush, in another scenario they were not in a rush. And then they had a situation that they would encounter that they didn't know was part of the experiment. And it was a person in need. And they were tested to see what would the rushing students do when presented with a need, what would the students that were unrushed do. And those that were unrushed were much more apt to help a person in need. The students that were told, "You're late, get there, rush over now," far less apt to help. So our chronic busyness and our deadening influences and our stress and always doing and multitasking, it takes a toll on our awareness to even perceive the needs around us and to cultivate being able to maintain a compassionate state inside from which we could respond with genuinely. I don't have a slide for this one, but there's a Paul Farmer quote that I wanted to sneak in here somewhere. "The only real nation is humanity." And I was thinking about that in the context of our work for Orange County for Darfur. And there are some that sometimes say to us, "Why do you focus on those other places when there's so many needs here?" And I think we are denying and we are blocking this sense of interconnectedness. That what happens over there does impact us here. And until we can get to this place of living within ourselves, keeping our hearts open, cultivating a deep contemplative inner life, where we really examine what is going on with us so that we can actually be available and present with each other. So that we can recognize the inhumanity within ourselves, that we're at risk of enacting if we have blind spots to it being within us. I mean, these are the stepping stones to getting to a place, to being able to live resonating with the interconnectedness of all of humanity. And I think there is a way in which all human beings have wounds. I mean, we do not get through, none of us get through this life without incurring betrayal and heartbreak and disappointment and many, many things, many different kinds of wounds. And there's an intergenerational process that goes on. We had parents, they had wounds. Did they resolve all their wounds? No, some of them got enacted upon their children. It's inevitable. But the more that we're able to bring healing into our own life, in a sense, I think we are healing the wounds of our ancestors because they're part of how we got these wounds today. And the work we do with ourselves to heal our own wounds, not just healing the wounds of our ancestors, we're setting the stage for there to be fewer wounds for the next generation to then have to deal with. And I tend to think that in our hectic pace, in our over-adrenalized society, we tend to be very impatient and we tend to not be able to pay attention for very long. And another consequence of this is there are times that we're going to have faith in the unseen. If we do an action and it's a right action and we get a good result and we see payoff, that's great. And that isn't always the way it is. Because sometimes things take a very, very long time. And if we're addicted to instant gratification, we're in trouble. So I think the faith in the unseen is a key part, because we need to live in the way we need to live. And sometimes we need to accept that the payoff may not even be in our lifetime. And you can look at examples such as Rosa Parks and know that she was not the beginning of a movement. And all those who suffered and struggled and worked hard before that incident, they didn't get to know if they were going to get a payoff or not. They had to stay true, they had to stay committed, they had to do what they believed in, with faith in the unseen. So I think we can expect some payoff on some things in our lifetime. And some things, if we don't see payoff in our lifetime, it doesn't mean it was wasted effort. Want to give the next slide? I put this in here because I like it, basically. But I thought it was interesting that Albert Schweitzer already got mentioned this morning. Until he extends the circle of compassion to all living creatures, man himself will not find peace. And I think, piggybacking a little bit on some of what was said this morning, until we can resonate within ourselves, within humanity, within the larger world around us, including the environment, including animals, we're a little bit in trouble, if not a lot of it. And so many of these things they start from this process within, of doing what we can to continue a lifetime of healing within, which enables us to have more to give out. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this next thing, and I'm going to kind of breeze through a couple things, and then I'm going to be done here soon. But I was thinking of, I kind of had 4 components of things that seem very under-recognized to me toward a more peaceful world and connected to the ways we need healing. Certainly one is recognizing and transforming the violence that is within us, and we all have it. Even if we don't act it out, we have the components of violence within us. So continuing that inner work. But the next thing is our tendency to chronically demonize others. The whole concept of other. Carl Wilkins, who was the only United States citizen that remained in Rwanda during the genocide, he was there as a missionary, and everyone else was evacuated out. He was the only US person that stayed because he thought he could help. And he talks time and time again about one of the components of genocide being the willingness to see the other. Trauma tends to encourage creating stereotypes, because when we're traumatized and we're not healed, part of the defensive mechanism of survival puts people into stereotyped categories. It's to save us, but it's not a way of life, and it needs to heal so that we can open back up and once again feel part of humanity. So under stress and trauma, we're actually more likely to otherize, more likely to demonize, to stereotype. I think we need to recognize more that there are certain situations in this world that if most anyone was in that situation, there's high risk that they would choose violent actions. That there are some things that would just be too much for almost anyone. And we've got to begin taking those on differently and better. And again, I would reference Rwanda just as a quick example, that most of the people that committed atrocities in Rwanda were not lifetime killers. You know, there were plenty of people that were neighbors, had lived peaceably together, were farmers, and under the right circumstances, they became genocidal killers. We can't fail to recognize that under the right circumstances, that might be us. The fourth one is, and this is something I tend to harp on over and over, often. Trauma in this world is a silent epidemic that we are grossly ignoring. We can't talk about traumatized individuals anymore. We have to talk about traumatized societies. We have to talk about mass epidemics. We need to talk about global trauma. And prioritizing methods of healing for mass numbers of people needs to be a much higher priority as part of the big picture. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? I mean, so often in today's world, we look at the bad guys and we think if only we kill them off, we will all be better. And yet if we recognize that within us all, we have the potential for good, we have the potential for ill, and we all wrestle with these choices. And we can't afford to take for granted how much we have here. that makes it much easier to be nonviolent. I saw a quote that was cited from being in a rabbinic text. In the places where there are no human beings, be one. In ending, I want to read a poem called Kindness. Some of you may be familiar with it. Before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things. Feel the future dissolve in a moment like salt in a weakened broth. What you held in your hand, what you counted and carefully saved, all this must go, so you know how desolate the landscape can be between the regions of kindness. How you ride and ride thinking the bus will never stop. The passengers eating maize and chicken will stare out the window forever. Before you learn the tender gravity of kindness, you must travel where the Indian in a white poncho lies dead by the side of the road. You must see how this could be you. How he too was someone who journeyed through the night with plans and the simple breath that kept him alive. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak to it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to mail letters and purchase bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, "It is I you have been looking for," and then goes with you everywhere, like a shadow or a friend. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Questions?
I've heard this twice today, compassion fatigue. I'm not that. What are the symptoms? Well, I know the symptoms are, but how does it manifest? Compassion fatigue.
I think compassion fatigue comes from dealing with too many situations without really dealing with the situations. So there's a culmination of really being in denial, perhaps, about how intensely difficult and emotional the situations we're dealing with is. This is something that professionals deal with. This is something we can get from being an activist. You know, this is something we can get from just living in the world today because we're bombarded. So I think compassion fatigue really pertains to a lot more of us than we recognize, because we get deadened down because there's too much. And a lot of it's horrifying. And we don't have good skills within the culture to deal with that which is horrifying. So we tend to kind of shut down because it gets deadening if you don't deal with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So how do we combat compassion fatigue?
I think dealing with compassion fatigue, one thing is take more breaks. Seriously, right? Because part of the deadening comes because we have natural processes to like deal with things and calm down. Deal with things and calm down. And we tend to get stuck because we go, 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 go. And the body doesn't get to calm down. We really have very good natural mechanisms. We just screw it up. But another thing is to allow your own process in whatever way you need it. And that means I really believe that for people that want to deal with very deep issues in the world, better be prepared to cry when they need to. Because every time we hold back, if we expect to go through hearing about atrocities, but we're going to act unaffected, we're going to be in trouble. And cultivating a life where routinely there are things that are restorative in your life. Whether that's being in nature, or doing something that brings you joy, or connecting with loved ones. I think the relational contact is hugely important. We need to be part of support networks of people that nourish us. I hope that helps.
Thanks for your talk. I heard once in a lecture about trauma that one of the key things that helps people recover from it is the ability to put it in context, that the trauma seems so consuming for them, but that when they see their life as a much larger thing than just that one incident or just that series of incidents or just that time, that helps them. One, do you agree with that, or is that, I don't know if I've expressed it, the way it was expressed to me, but that was one thing I heard. And B, what other sort of elements would you say are key or sort of core ideas about how this recovery that you're talking about happens?
Yeah. I would say that I see that more as the result of having healed.
Okay.
That is not the healing process to get someone there, right? That when one is healed, there's a more coherent narrative. And it sits in a context, and there's an acceptance of what life has been in a new and different way. The components of getting there can be very individual, but in tendency, kind of in gross simplicity here, trauma actually is blocked in the body, right? It's a physiological thing. And often people try to do debriefing and think of it as if it's this intellectual thing, as if it's this psychological thing. And it really involves your whole body. So there are more methods nowadays that actually engage the body's processes, because ultimately to be able to heal the part that is psychological or is emotional or is of the heartbreak, the body has to calm down first. So I often teach a method that was developed by Dave Berselli, who was working in southern Sudan, and he actually did it in large groups of people. It's something that people can learn. They do it on their own. They don't need a psychotherapist. It helps them calm down. Once they calm down, like in southern Sudan, they're not going to go see a psychotherapist. Once they calm down, they meet together with those in the village that understand the experience, and then they talk. And they connect, and they support each other. And I think that another way I'd sum that up is that we need someone present with us to bear witness. And it has to be someone that is present and emotionally available, who will get it and not put an agenda. And oftentimes that means that it's someone that won't be afraid of the pain. And usually that's someone who's done somewhat of some work within themselves to create that capacity to be able to be there and bear witness. But I think getting the body to calm down combined with being able to have someone bear witness to the pain are two of the really important components of getting there. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I have a question for you. I do agree that we're all wounded and that it is hard for people that don't have a lot of money to get access to the resources they do need. So I guess my first question is, if you don't have a lot of money, how do you get access to the resources you do need? And then how do I or other people recognize in someone else what you said about someone who has done the work of healing themselves? Like, how will I know someone is healed when I meet them or become friends with them or I'm close to them?
Yeah.
Because I think some people are just better at faking it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Sometimes that's tough. Sometimes we intuitively can recognize someone that is really present, and sometimes people fool us.
Can you repeat the questions?
I didn't get the microphone. I didn't hear your question.
Okay, do you want to say it again into the microphone?
Okay. I agree with you that I think a lot of us are wounded, or all of us are wounded to some point. My question is, since you said a lot of people don't have money to get the access to resources they need, what's your advice to people to get help that can't afford it? And then how do we recognize people that are healed so that we can become friends with them or have them listen to us or help us on our journey?
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
recognizing that they are really healed and not just faking it.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, on the other component of your question, what I'd say is I don't have a lot of good answers for how people who don't have resources get help, other than that's why we started the organization, because there's a real gap. And there are some, but there's a real shortage, and a lot of what's out there isn't high quality. And that's what we're trying to create, you know, and I mean, we're still at a very young place, but that's exactly what we're seeking to address, and to do it differently. So that we can, like for instance, we're seeking funding so that we can start trauma recovery down in the community, like in Santa Ana and in Anaheim, where it's accessible and that people that don't have money can come for free. And targeting those areas where domestic violence and child abuse rates are highest. So those are the kinds of things that we are seeking to create. And, you know, and we do offer some things if you're actually interested in what we do through workshops and groups and so forth and so on, and I could explain more of that later if we talk or something. But the other question is a more difficult question of, you know, how do you recognize the right person? And that's challenging. That's challenging. I can't give you a good answer to that.
I don't know if this was already said or clear, but I was curious about what is healing and in general. And this may tie back to that question a little bit, maybe about how do you recognize the person who's healed. It may bounce back there, but I think more in general, like how are you defining healing, and what does that mean?
I think, like, I mean, I really think that healing is the lifetime. You know? I mean, there's always things happening. We're always in process. It's the lifetime. So I think it would be, you know, a misnomer to say someone is healed as if it's a mark in time and they're going to live there the rest of their life. And we're also talking about shades of gray and on a continuum, right? But how much can someone sort of, you know, feel at peace within themselves and feel like they've sort of come to a place of accepting what's happened to them, right? And the outward, how do you recognize it in someone else? I think, you know, if someone is there, you know, and they feel really present with you when you're talking, you tend to notice that, right? If you feel like someone is really quiet and calm and you feel the other body, you feel the resonance of the other body with you differently than somebody's kind of frenetically talking and scattered and going through the motions. I mean, if you really kind of check in, we do have a little bit of radar for checking out when something feels fake or it feels authentic. You know? So that's a very imprecise best answer for you.
So healing then is getting you to a place that you can consistently deal with whatever is thrown at you.
Well, I think the more healing that you've incurred, it increases your capacity to deal with more. That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. I mean, you can kind of think, I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of healings, right? So specific to trauma, right? When we are traumatized, initially we pull in, we're contracted, our worldview gets smaller, and we're more apt to stereotype and see enemies in the world. We get more scared, we're more paranoid, and many other things happen. After healing, we open back up. We've integrated the experience into who we are. We see life differently. We have a different, bigger worldview, and we're more understanding and compassionate because our old image of the world got shattered, we now have a new one that is more alive. And oftentimes the more of these experiences, sort of a going in, pulling in, contracting to the experience, coming out bigger. And each time we come out with a bigger capacity to then be with, be understanding, be present, be a healing presence with another. Are we done?
One more? Last question?
First of all, I wanted to thank you for an amazing talk. You said a few things that really landed very powerfully for me, and one of them, I have to admit, you used a term that I imagine I should have heard at some point in time, and maybe I did, but it just didn't land for me the way that it did today. But you used the term otherize, and I've been sitting here contemplating the power of that term, and what I realize is that what it really does is it makes it very clear to me that separation or the absence of connectedness is not something that is inherent or by nature, you know, how we would experience life, but it actually requires that we take action to reach that point. We have to actually otherize other people. So it's a conscious choice. It's not even a conscious choice day by day or hour by hour, but literally moment by moment, we can choose to either be otherizing or not that, connecting, and accepting our inherent connection with other people. So I just wanted to thank you for the speech in general, but that term is huge for me, and I have a feeling I'm going to be at least trying to be conscious about whether I'm otherizing or not doing that over the next few days and hopefully ongoingly.
Yeah, great, thank you.